Solis Vex was having one of those days where everything felt like a bad hangover, except he hadn't had a drop. The neural network city of Lattice hummed around him, its digital veins pulsing with annoying efficiency. Bright neon signs flickered above, advertising everything from cerebral enhancements to NutriPace subscriptions, all promising the same thing, a better tomorrow that never arrived. Solis tapped the side of his head, trying to get his augments to stop buzzing. You'd think he grumbled to no one in particular, that in the future they'd invent technology that didn't give you a migraine. Keep talking to yourself and they'll put you on a psych watch, came a voice from the other side of the cluttered workshop. Quillen Seraph, diplomat extraordinaire, or so he said. Solis had yet to see any evidence of diplomacy in Quillen's behavior, but that was bureaucracy for you. Quillen strolled over, his suit pristine despite the chaos around him. You hear about the artifact? He asked, eyes gleaming with the kind of excitement usually reserved for kids at a zero-gravity amusement park. Artifact. Solis raised an eyebrow, his curiosity mildly piqued. The last great discovery was a rusty toaster that nearly blew up my lab. This is different, Quillen insisted, leaning against a table overflowing with half-finished gadgets and tools. They found it on the outskirts of the city, buried in some ancient wreckage. Rumors say it's an alien weapon. Rumors also say you can lose 50 pounds in a week on the rad diet. Solis shot back, eyeing Quillen's slim frame. I'm skeptical of both, nice, but seriously, this thing might be real. And if it's real, it could change everything. Solis snorted, turning back to his work. Please, Quillen, everything already changes every 5 minutes around here, usually for the worse. Why should I care about another piece of cosmic junk? Because, Quillen said, leaning in with a conspiratorial whisper, this cosmic junk is starting to mess with the city's neural net. That got Solis' attention. He turned slowly, fixing Quillen with a stare that could melt steel. Messing with the net? You mean the thing that keeps us from tearing each other apart? Sounds delightful. Quillen nodded, his expression turning serious. Yeah, delightful. There's already been fights breaking out. People are getting strange how? Solis prompted, though he could already imagine the possibilities. Paranoia, hallucinations, the usual funhouse ride of human madness. Strange like seeing things that aren't there. Picking fights over the last cup of coffee in the dispenser. Or I don't know, trying to mate with their toaster. Solis shook his head, exasperated. And you thought, hey, let's bring this to Solis. He loves dealing with apocalyptic-grade screw-ups, more like, hey, Solis is the only one I know who's stupid enough to help, Quillen corrected with a grin. Flattery will get you everywhere, Solis deadpanned, but he was already grabbing his toolkit. Whatever this artifact was, it sounded like it could lead to some entertaining chaos. At worst, it would be a distraction from the neural din that never seemed to leave his skull. The streets of Lattice were a chaotic ballet of drones, hovercars, and pedestrians who had long since decided that traffic laws were more like vague suggestions. Solis and Quillen made their way through the throng, stepping over a particularly ambitious street performer who had decided that the best use of his time was to juggle plasma grenades. Isn't that a bit dangerous? Solis asked, nodding toward the performer. Only if he drops one, Quillen replied, unfazed. Comforting, they arrived at the excavation site, if a gaping hole surrounded by anxious scientists and heavily armed security could be called that. The artifact lay at the center, a twisted mass of metal and circuitry that seemed to hum with a life of its own. It looked like a sculpture made by someone with both too much time and too little sanity. This is it, Quillen said, gesturing grandly as if unveiling a new model of the universe. The artifact. Solis stared at it, unimpressed. Looks like a junkyard threw up, but it's alien junk, Quillen pointed out as if that made all the difference. A scientist approached, looking frazzled and slightly singed. We've been trying to study it, but the damn thing keeps influencing people in what way? Solis asked, already regretting the question. Have you ever seen a grown man bark like a dog while balancing a cup on his head? Solis blinked. Can't say that I have, but it's now on my bucket list. Then you're in for a show. Keep an eye on Dr. Lentz over there. The scientist pointed to a man who was indeed barking at a bewildered security officer. Charming, Solis murmured, stepping closer to the artifact. He could almost feel it vibrating in the air, like it was singing some cosmic lullaby that only lunatics could hear. What do you think? Quillen asked, watching Solis closely. I think it's going to be a long night, Solis replied, already running through a mental list of the tools he'd need to get a handle on this thing. And a lot of people are going to get very, very weird. Business as usual then. Quillen laughed, but there was an edge to it. Even he could sense the gravity of the situation. Yes, just another day in paradise, Solis quipped, though even he felt the weight of what lay ahead. If this artifact was as dangerous as it seemed, then they would have to tread carefully. One wrong move and Lattice could be reduced to a smoldering wreck, or worse, a city of lunatics, each convinced they were the sole sane person left. With one last look at the artifact, Solis turned to Quillen determined. Let's see what this thing can really do. And with that, they descended into the chaos, ready, or perhaps resigned, to face whatever madness awaited them. Solis Vex and Quillen Seraph, the dynamic duo of dysfunction, made their way to the city council chambers, a place where political dreams go to die a slow, bureaucratic death. Nyx Lattice, the neural network city, buzzed and flickered in the background, its digital veins pulsating like a bad techno beat. As they navigated through the bustling chaos of the streets, Solis couldn't help but notice the signs of the artifact's influence creeping in. A street vendor was trying to sell emotionally enhanced hot dogs, promising a taste experience so profound it could make you weep. A couple of hovercars nearby were locked in a passive-aggressive duel, their drivers too busy shouting at each other in a chorus of colorful language to actually move. And then there was the businessman in a suit, passionately debating with a lamppost about the finer points of corporate tax law. Things are really starting to go pear-shaped, Solis muttered, adjusting his toolkit as they passed the scene. Quillen, ever the optimist, shrugged. It's Nyx Lattice. Maybe people were always this crazy and we just didn't notice. Sounds like something a crazy person would say. They reached the council building, a towering monument to misguided intentions and ill-conceived policies. The place was crawling with officials, each more self-important than the last. Solis had always thought of politicians like augments, promised to make things better, but usually just gave you a headache. Inside, they were greeted by an aide who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Her expression was one of practiced disinterest, a skill honed by years of dealing with people who thought they were more important than they actually were. We're here to see the council, Quillen announced, puffing up like a peacock trying to impress a mirror. Do you have an appointment? The aide asked, her voice flat as weak-cold soda. Quillen blinked. No, but then take a number. Solis rolled his eyes, already tired of the song and dance. Listen, we've got information that's kind of important. Like city might implode kind of important. The aide scrolled through her holographic display, uninterested. Imploding cities are scheduled for next Thursday. You're early. Quillen opened his mouth to protest, but Solis cut him off. Let's just find someone who cares, he muttered, already moving past the aide, who didn't even bother to stop them. Everyone had learned that saying no in Nyx Lattice was just a polite way of saying try harder. The council chamber was an arena of polished wood and synthetic fibers, with council members perched on their thrones like crows on a power line. The head of the council, Councillor Vorda, was a man who looked like someone had taken a grumpy old lion and taught it how to frown with more authority. Solis cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed council members, we've got a problem. Vorda raised an eyebrow, the only indication that he was even remotely interested. And what might that be, Mr. Vex? There's an artifact. Quillen jumped in, eager to reclaim some spotlight, and it's messing with the city's neural net. People are going bonkers. A ripple of murmurs washed through the room, some council members exchanging glances and whispers that could mean anything from this is serious to did I leave the oven on at home? An artifact, you say? Vorda said, leaning back in his chair. We've heard rumors, of course. But how do we know this isn't just another overblown conspiracy theory? Solis sighed, resisting the urge to thump his head against the lectern. Because it's real and it's doing weird things to people. If we don't do something, Nyx Lattice will turn into a madhouse. A younger council member, with a haircut that could cut glass, leaned forward eagerly. And this artifact, what does it offer? Unpredictable danger, Solis suggested, though he could see where this was going. Potentially unlimited power, Quillen added, his voice taking on that seductive tone politicians loved. Vorda's eyes gleamed with interest. Unlimited power, you say? Depends how you define unlimited, Solis interjected, but yeah, something like that. The council members exchanged looks, the kind that usually preceded a series of very bad decisions. Solis could almost see the wheels turning in their heads, visions of grandeur dancing alongside delusions of control. Vorda rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Interesting. Perhaps this artifact is worth investigating further. Investigating, sure, Solis said, but you're missing the part where it's dangerous. We need to contain it, not play with it like a new toy. Dangerous, Vorda echoed dismissively. All great power is dangerous, Mr. Vex. It's what we do with it that counts. Right, like how you handle city budgets, Solis muttered under his breath. Quillen nudged him with an elbow, sensing the tide was turning against them. What my colleague means is we need caution. If this thing gets out of control, it won't matter who's in charge. Perhaps Vorda agreed, though the gleam in his eye suggested he was already envisioning himself as the benevolent ruler of a new order. But it's a risk we're willing to take. Of course you are, Solis said, exasperated. Let's just hand the keys to the lunatic asylum over to the inmates. That'll end well. The council seemed to take that as a cue to start debating amongst themselves, a chorus of voices blending into a cacophony of self-interest and ambition. Solis turned to Quillen, shaking his head. Why do I feel like we just opened Pandora's box and everyone's cheering? Because we did, Quillen replied, casting a wary glance around the room. And now we've got to make sure they don't blow up the city while fighting over the pieces. Great, because I've always wanted to babysit a group of power-hungry idiots, Solis remarked, though he was already gearing up for the challenge ahead. As the council continued to argue, oblivious to the real threat, Solis and Quillen slipped out of the chamber. Outside, the city hummed with an undercurrent of unease, the neural net flickering like an overworked circuit board. They needed a plan and fast. Where to now? Quillen asked as they emerged onto the street. Back to the artifact, Solis replied, determination hardening in his voice. We need to figure out what it's doing and how to stop it before these fools turn Lattice into a war zone. Sounds like a plan, Quillen agreed, though the weight of the task ahead was palpable. And if this all goes to hell, Solis smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Then at least we'll have a front row seat to the apocalypse. They set off into the chaotic swirl of the city, two unlikely heroes against a backdrop of impending doom. Solis could almost hear the artifact's call, a siren song that promised power amidst the wreckage. But as they moved, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time, and the clock was ticking louder than ever. Night had fallen over Lattice, covering the city in an eerie glow that only added to its dystopian charm. Solis and Quillen made their way back to the excavation site, the air buzzing with the kind of tension that usually preceded something spectacularly disastrous. The artifact still sat in the center, a grotesque statue of twisted metal and alien circuitry. It seemed to pulse with an inner light now, casting strange shadows that danced across the faces of the scientists and security personnel who were trying and failing to maintain order. Back for more, the frazzled scientist from earlier asked, looking more disheveled than ever. Things have escalated, oh really? Solis replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I hadn't noticed. Thought the barking man was a new performance art piece. The scientist sighed, rubbing his temples. We've lost control of 3 different sectors. People are acting out of character, and the neural net's getting more erratic by the hour. Great. So basically, the usual Monday morning, Quillen quipped, though the humor didn't quite mask the worry in his eyes. Solis approached the artifact, his mind racing with possibilities and potential solutions. We need to figure out what it's feeding on. What's causing it to spread? Good question, the scientist said, though he sounded more exasperated than helpful. We've tried running scans, but every time we get close it scrambles the equipment, like it doesn't want to be understood. Solis mused, though he wasn't surprised. Nothing about this artifact suggested it was eager to be solved. Quillen joined him, studying the strange object with a mix of fascination and dread. Maybe it's responding to the neural net itself, like it's tapping into the city's network. Solis nodded, the theory making uncomfortable sense. Which means the more connected we are, the stronger it gets. Wonderful, Quillen muttered, the ultimate parasite. Why can't we ever find artifacts that just want to give us free candy? Because the universe hates us, Solis replied, though he was already moving, rifling through his toolkit for anything that might help. They worked late into the night, improvising solutions and running tests that yielded more questions than answers. All the while, the city around them descended further into chaos, a symphony of madness conducted by an unseen hand. As dawn approached, Solis felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down, but he couldn't afford to stop. Not when they were so close to figuring out how to contain this thing before the council's ambitions turned catastrophic. We need to isolate it, Solis said finally, turning to Quillen with a spark of realization. Cut it off from the network, starve it, and how do we do that? Quillen asked, though the wheels were already turning in his mind. Old tech, Solis replied, a plan forming amidst the chaos. Something it can't connect to. We build a Faraday cage, block its signals. Quillen grinned despite the gravity of the situation. You know, if this doesn't work, we're just going to look like 2 idiots in a tin can. Story of my life, Solis said with a shrug. But hey, maybe we'll get lucky. With renewed purpose, they set to work, gathering materials and enlisting the help of those few who weren't completely under the artifact's thrall. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble against an unknown force. But as the first light of dawn broke over Lattice, Solis felt something akin to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could pull this off and keep the city from tearing itself apart. And if not, well, at least they'd go down swinging. Solis and Quillen stood at the edge of the Lattice, where the city's veneer of futuristic wonder had worn thin, revealing the rusty underbelly of civilization. The neural network that once breathed life into the metropolis now coughed and spluttered like an asthmatic chain smoker. Streetlights flickered erratically, hovercars hovered more than they carred, and the digital advertisements promised services that not even the most gullible citizen would buy into, save for the emotionally enhanced hot dogs. Those were still selling like. Well, like hot dogs in a world where everyone was too stressed to care. Who knew the end of the world would look so anticlimactic? Quillen mused, kicking an errant NutriPaste subscription can down the street. It pinged off a nearby wall, triggering a series of flashes from a malfunctioning public holo display. At least it's consistent, Solis replied, casting a wary eye at a nearby hovercar that appeared to be having an existential crisis. Everything's going to hell in a handbasket, one glitch at a time. They moved cautiously through the chaos, stepping over the occasional sprawl of wires and detritus that cluttered the streets. The city's rhythm had gone from a smooth techno beat to an unholy symphony of discordant sounds, half the population yapping in binary, the rest just plain barking, like they'd all joined the same avant-garde band. "We need Leora," Solis said, more to himself than Quillen. Leora Kettler was the kind of person who made hermits look like social butterflies, but she was also the only person who could possibly make sense of the madness unfolding. Her expertise in tech was only surpassed by her disdain for the rest of humanity. "Do you think she'll help us?" Quillen asked, ducking as a drone zipped past, its camera eye blinking furiously as if confused by the chaos. "Help." "Probably not," Solis admitted, "but she might take pity on us, or at least enjoy watching us squirm." "Ah, the sweet lure of schadenfreude," Quillen said, "nothing like a little shared misery to bring people together." They navigated through alleyways and side streets, the air dense with static from the failing network. It was like walking through a drunken electronic forest, the trees all whispering encrypted secrets in drunken slurs. Finally, they reached Leora's Haven, a nondescript building that seemed to repel technology rather than house it. The structure was a patchwork of old metal scraps, possibly the only place in Nick's Lattice where the walls didn't hum with digital life. Solis approached the door and knocked, the sound echoing like a death knell. The door swung open to reveal Leora, a woman whose appearance seemed to proclaim, "I have better things to do than talk to you." Her hair was an unkempt tangle, her eyes sharp behind the kind of glasses that suggested she saw everything, whether she wanted to or not. "Ah," Solis Vex and Quillen Seraph, Leora greeted them with a smile that could cut glass. "To what do I owe the displeasure? We need your help," Solis said, cutting straight to the point. "The city's turning into one massive glitch and the artifact is playing puppet master." Leora snorted, unimpressed. "And you think I care about any of that?" "Not particularly," Quillen chimed in, leaning casually against the doorframe. "But we figured you might enjoy the challenge. Plus, you've got front row seats to this little apocalypse of yours. Why not get involved?" She considered them for a moment, her gaze piercing. "You're assuming I haven't already got my own plans." "Assuming you do," Solis replied. "Wouldn't it be nice to have a couple of idiots on hand to run interference? Persistent, aren't you?" Leora sighed, though a glimmer of interest flickered in her eyes. "All right, get in. But if you start yammering about saving the world, I'm kicking you out." Inside, Leora's sanctuary was a contradiction in itself, a cluttered mess of ancient tech and modern marvels, all interwoven like a madman's tapestry. It was a place that screamed functionality over form, with wires spilling out of walls like veins in a tired body, and screens flashing with data that only Leora seemed capable of deciphering. "I've been monitoring the network," Leora said, gesturing dismissively at a screen filled with indecipherable code. "The artifact signals are evolving, adapting." "Great, a self-improving menace," Quillen sighed. "Just what we need." "Indeed," Leora agreed, moving to another terminal with the grace of a dancer who'd been practicing the same routine for years. "Your idea about the Faraday cage was decent, but it won't be enough. We need to go bigger." Solis raised an eyebrow. "How much bigger?" She smirked, a hint of madness creeping into her voice. "Citywide, if we're going to cut off its access completely." "Citywide?" Solis echoed, incredulous. "We can't just unplug the whole city." "Oh, but you can," Leora said, her fingers flying over the keyboard as data cascaded across the screens. "And you will if you want to stop it." Quillen and Solis exchanged a glance. "So what's the plan?" Quillen asked, his voice edged with a mixture of excitement and dread. Leora returned her gaze to them, eyes alight with the kind of glee usually reserved for mad scientists in bad holo movies. "I've got a prototype, a disruptor that could dampen the neural net signals. We'll need to plant it at key nodes across the city. But it'll take time, and time is something you don't have much of. And if we fail," Solis asked, already knowing the answer. "Then we get front row seats to the city's implosion," Leora replied with a shrug. "But hey, at least it'll be entertaining." Solis sighed, running a hand through his hair. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all they had. "All right," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Let's do it." As Leora said about preparing the disruptor, Solis and Quillen strategized, outlining their plan to navigate the city and deploy the devices. It was a high-stakes game, a race against a clock they couldn't see, but at least now they had a fighting chance. The air was thick with anticipation, every second a reminder of the chaos outside. Hovercars sputtered overhead, and the neural net's flickering presence was a constant reminder of the sword hanging over their heads. "Ready?" Quillen asked, hoisting a backpack filled with the disruptor prototypes. Ready as I'll ever be, Solis replied, his voice steady. Let's do this. They set off into the heart of Nyx Lattice, Leora's instructions fresh in their minds. Each node they passed was another step closer to salvation or ruin. The city was a labyrinth of lights and shadows, the air humming with barely constrained energy as they navigated through throngs of confused and increasingly erratic citizens. At the first node, nestled beneath a heaving mass of tangled conduits, Solis carefully placed the disruptor. It was a small device, deceptively simple, with a series of blinking lights that seemed to mock the enormity of the task ahead. One down, a million more to go, Quillen said, his voice barely audible over the electric cacophony. Optimism suits you, Solis replied dryly, monitoring the device until it began to hum in harmony with the city's discordant symphony. Each subsequent node was a testament to their resilience, their determination to outpace the ticking clock of disaster. They moved with purpose amidst the chaos, the city's pulse erratic, the neural net's grip slipping but not yet broken. As the last disruptor was placed, Solis and Quillen stood back, breaths mingling with the electric haze that enveloped Nyx Lattice. Now what? Quillen asked, the question hanging in the air like the final note of a requiem. Now we watch and hope, Solis replied, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of change. The city around them shivered, a ripple of tension coursing through its digital veins. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the neural net gasping in protest as the disruptors began their work. And then slowly the chaos began to subside. Hovercars stabilized, the flickering lights found their rhythm, and the buzz of the neural net softened, no longer a shrill scream but a muted whisper. Did we actually do it? Quillen asked, disbelief coloring his tone. Looks like it, Solis replied, though his eyes remained skeptical, searching for any lurking threat. Leora joined them, her expression one of satisfaction. Impressive, she admitted, and though her words were begrudging, there was no mistaking the hint of respect in her voice. We stopped it at least for now, Solis said, the weight of their achievement settling over him like a mantle. But it's not over, Leora warned, her gaze fixing on the horizon. The artifact's still out there. This was just a temporary fix. Yeah, Quillen agreed, his voice laced with determination. But it's a start. As the sun rose over Nyx Lattice, casting long shadows over the city, Solis and Quillen knew their work was far from finished. The artifact's threat remained, a lingering specter in the backdrop of their victory. But for now, they'd managed to pull the city back from the edge. And as they stood amidst the restored calm, they couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, a hope as fragile as the city they fought to protect, but a hope nonetheless. The flickering neon lights of Nyx Lattice were as reliable as a politician's promise, sputtering and bleeding across the city like a bad case of interstellar acne. Solis Vex and Quillen Seraph trudged through the chaos, the afterglow of their minor victory over the neural net's tantrum already fading like last night's cheap liquor buzz. Well, that was anticlimactic, Quillen muttered, sidestepping a puddle of something that looked suspiciously biological. What now? Pat ourselves on the back and wait for the next apocalypse. Solis smirked, though it was more grimace than grin. Don't get too comfortable. We've only managed to slap a bandage on a bullet wound, and I'm pretty sure the artifact is just gearing up for an encore. Quillen sighed, glancing at the sky where drones buzzed like mechanical mosquitoes. Always the pessimist, Solis. I prefer to think of it as delayed Armageddon. They weren't the only ones out and about, of course. Nyx Lattice's citizens wandered the streets with the dazed, twitchy confusion of people who'd just been told their favorite soap opera wasn't real. Leora's words about the artifact amplifying human emotions echoed in Solis's mind, a subtle reminder that the city was one big, dysfunctional family reunion away from an all-out brawl. Speaking of which, Solis said, nudging Quillen and nodding towards a gathering crowd, looks like emotions are running high. The cluster of humanity in front of them was a microcosm of Nyx Lattice chaos, fists flying, voices raised, and alliances being formed and broken faster than a politician's promises on election day. Looks like the gangs are getting restless, Quillen observed, sidestepping a thrown bottle. Or maybe it's just a citywide therapy session gone horribly wrong. Either way, Solis said, eyes scanning for an exit strategy, it's about to get ugly. As if on cue, a hovercar veered wildly overhead, its driver apparently inspired by the chaos below. It narrowly missed them, crashing into a vacant storefront with a screech that echoed through the alleyways. Add vehicular manslaughter to the list of today's festivities, Quillen quipped, watching the car's smoldering remains with detached curiosity. Focus, Quillen, Solis replied, pulling him back towards the task at hand. We need to figure out how this artifact is manipulating people, and fast. The sudden screech of a public holo display caught their attention, its image flickering and distorted like a reflection in broken glass. The message it broadcasted was garbled, yet somehow still managed to convey a sense of impending doom. urging the citizens of Lattice to embrace the chaos, to feed the fracturing city with their fear and aggression. That's one hell of a motivational speech, Quillen noted dryly. Maybe the artifact's trying to launch a career in public speaking. More like it's auditioning for the role of evil overlord, Solis replied, mind racing through potential solutions. If we can't shut it down, the city's going to tear itself apart. Leora had mentioned something about emotions, fear, aggression, joy being amplified by the artifact. It was like the universe's worst therapist, coaxing out humanity's darkest impulses and turning them up to 11. Maybe we need to change the frequency, Solis mused aloud, a half-baked plan forming in his mind. Quillen raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. What, like tune everyone to the Happy Thoughts channel? Sort of, Solis said, eyes narrowing as he considered the logistics. If we can counteract the artifact signal with one of our own, something that dampens those amplified emotions, we might buy ourselves some time. Sounds like a job for our resident techno-hermit, Quillen said, nodding towards Leora's sanctuary. Think she'll help? Solis grinned, though it was more sardonic than hopeful. Depends. She might just enjoy watching us flounder. They made their way back to Leora's lair, their journey punctuated by sporadic bursts of violence and the ever-present hum of the city's failing infrastructure. It was like walking through a war zone where the only casualty was sanity. When they reached the familiar metal patchwork door, Solis knocked with a confidence he didn't quite feel. Leora opened it with her usual expression of barely concealed disdain, though there was a glimmer of curiosity in her eyes. Back so soon? She asked, gesturing for them to enter. I expected at least a minor natural disaster before you came begging for help again. We need more than a band-aid, Solis said, cutting to the chase. The artifact's messing with people's emotions. We need to counteract the signal. Leora's interest peaked, a small smile playing on her lips. A tall order, but not impossible. I've been tinkering with something that might work, an emotional dampener. Quillen gave a low whistle. Who knew you were moonlighting as a therapist? Ha, as if, Leora snorted, leading them to a table cluttered with parts and devices that looked both ancient and futuristic. It's experimental, untested, might just make things worse. Great, so it's like everything else in the city, Solis said, examining the device with a cautious eye. What's the catch? Catch is you'll need to plant these at key locations around the city, Leora explained, her voice brisk and businesslike. Same nodes as before, but this time we're targeting emotional hotspots, places where people are most likely to succumb to the artifact's influence. Quillen nodded, picking up one of the devices and weighing it in his hand. And if it works, we get a city full of apathetic zombies instead of raging lunatics. Exactly, Leora confirmed, her expression serious. But remember, this is a stopgap measure at best. The artifact's not going to take this lying down. Solis and Quillen exchanged a glance, the weight of their mission settling over them like a storm cloud. It was a desperate plan, but desperate was all they had. Well, Quillen said, slinging the dampener-laden backpack over his shoulder, no time like the present to save the world again. They set off once more into the fray, their path taking them through the city's underbelly, where tension simmered like a pot about to boil over. The emotional hotspots were easy to find, anywhere people congregated, argued, or simply existed in too close proximity. As they moved, Solis couldn't help but marvel at humanity's adaptability. Even in the face of looming disaster, people found ways to cope, sometimes through humor, other times through sheer stubbornness. It was a resilience that both inspired and frustrated him. First spots up ahead, Quillen said, nodding towards a crowded marketplace where tempers flared as hot as the sizzling NutriPaste stands. Solis placed the dampener with the deftness of a street magician, its activation marked by a soft hum that seemed to resonate in his bones. It was a small thing, a whisper against the cacophony of chaos, but it was a start. One down, Quillen said, watching the crowd with wary eyes. Let's hope it actually does something. They continued their mission, moving from hotspot to hotspot like bees pollinating a particularly hostile garden. Each dampener they placed was a tenuous thread woven into the fabric of the city's survival, a gamble against the odds. As they neared the final node, Solis couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, a shadow lurking at the edge of his vision. Something's up, he murmured to Quillen, scanning the crowd with practiced subtlety. Paranoia setting in already? Quillen replied, though his eyes were equally alert. Maybe the artifacts got a sense of humor after all. Solis's retort was cut off by a sudden commotion, the crowd parting like a tide before a pack of heavily armed enforcers. Their uniforms were a patchwork of conflicting allegiances, a visual representation of the city's fractured state. Looks like we've got company, Quillen said, his voice low and tense. The enforcers approached with the kind of swagger that suggested they'd won more than a few bar fights in their time. Their leader, a grizzled veteran with more scars than common sense, eyed Solis and Quillen with a mixture of suspicion and malice. "You two look like trouble," the leader growled, his voice a gravelly threat. "What are you up to?" Solis met his gaze with practiced indifference. "Just taking in the sights," he said, his tone casual. "Lovely day for it, don't you think?" The leader wasn't amused, his scowl deepening. "Funny guy, how about you explain why you're fiddling with the city's infrastructure?" Quillen stepped in, his charm turned up to 11. "Just a little civic duty," he said, flashing a disarming grin. "Trying to keep things from falling apart, you know how it is." The leader wasn't buying it, and his men were inching closer, hands hovering near their weapons. "I'm thinking you two are the ones causing all this chaos." "Us?" Solis asked, feigning innocence. "We're the good guys, just ask anyone." The leader's eyes narrowed, suspicion etched into every line of his face. "I'll be keeping an eye on you," he warned, backing away with deliberate slowness. "Looking forward to it," Solis replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. As the enforcers moved on, Solis and Quillen shared a relieved glance. They'd dodged a bullet for now. "Back to business," Solis said, refocusing on their task. "We're almost done." The final dampener was placed with the precision of a surgeon, its activation a quiet promise of hope amid the chaos. Solis felt a flicker of optimism, a dangerous emotion in a city like Lattice, but one he couldn't quite squash. As they made their way back to Leora's lair, the city around them seemed to breathe a little easier. The tensions remained, a constant undercurrent of aggression and fear, but there was a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. Leora met them at the door, her expression one of cautious approval. "You actually did it," she said, a hint of respect in her voice. "Temporary fix," Solis reminded her, though he couldn't help but feel a small measure of pride. "Temporary is better than nothing," Leora replied, her gaze drifting towards the horizon where the sun was setting in a blaze of fiery colors. "But don't get comfortable. The artifact's not done with us yet." Solis nodded, the weight of their task still pressing down on him. The city might be safe for the moment, but the threat remained, a shadow lurking at the edge of their victory. Quillen clapped a hand on Solis's shoulder, his grin lopsided but genuine. "Guess we'll just have to save the world again tomorrow." Solis chuckled, the sound more of a release than amusement. Wouldn't have it any other way. As they stood together, watching the city settle into a fragile peace, Solis knew their work was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could pull Lattice back from the brink. And if not, well, at least they'd go down fighting. The city of Lattice was teetering on the edge of war, and Solis felt like he was doing the same with his sanity. The chaos that had been brewing was finally coming to a head, and as he stood in the shadow of crumbling buildings and flickering neon lights, he couldn't help but think that the apocalypse was a bit of a disappointment. Sure, there were riots and people were losing their minds, but he had expected something more, cinematic, maybe a giant asteroid or an alien invasion. But no, just the usual human idiocy dialed up to 11. "Really thought the end of the world would be more dramatic," Quillen said, echoing Solis's thoughts as he kicked a piece of rubble across the cracked pavement. "Yes, I was hoping for at least one fire-breathing dragon," Solis replied, adjusting the strap of his backpack laden with Leora's emotional dampeners. "Instead, we got emotionally enhanced hot dogs and malfunctioning neural nets. Life's full of disappointments," Quillen said with a shrug, "but at least our thrilling plan to disable the artifact is almost complete. You ready to face down the big bad faction leader who's lost his marbles?" "Can't wait," Solis replied dryly, though his stomach twisted at the thought. What's life without a little doomed heroism? They made their way through the city, steering clear of the hotspots where dampeners hummed in a valiant, but likely futile attempt to keep the city from tearing itself apart. People glanced at them with eyes that simmered with barely contained rage or, worse, the hollow emptiness of those already numbed by the emotional dampeners. Leora joined them at the entrance to the city's crumbling ruins of what was once a grand council chamber, a place where political dreams went to die a slow, bureaucratic death. She looked as unimpressed by the scene as Solis felt. "I'm assuming you two geniuses have a plan that doesn't involve getting us all killed," she asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Wouldn't bet on it," Quillen replied with a grin. "But it might make for an interesting evening. Besides, who wants to die of boredom? Speak for yourself," Solis muttered, though he felt a reluctant smile tug at his lips. Inside, the council chambers were a mess of toppled chairs and shattered screens, the chaos a testament to the kind of democracy Lattice had always trafficked in, chaotic, loud, and not particularly effective. It seemed oddly fitting that this was where their final confrontation would take place. In the far corner, a figure stood alone, silhouetted by the broken light fixtures that sputtered and died like everything else in the city. The faction leader, a man who once commanded respect with his sharp suits and sharper wit, now looked like a mad prophet of doom, his eyes wild and unseeing. Ah, the famous Solis and Quillen, the leader rasped, his voice as ragged as his clothes. Here to save the day, are we? Someone's got to, Solis replied, his tone more confident than he felt. And you seem a bit preoccupied with your impending breakdown. The leader laughed, a sound as broken as the room they stood in. Do you really think you can stop it? The artifact's power is beyond your comprehension. Don't have to understand it to turn it off, Quillen said, ever the optimist. Besides, your little chaos machine is just a glorified mood ring on steroids. My power will bring order, the leader insisted, though his eyes betrayed the madness within. A new world free from the shackles of emotional restraint. Sounds like a blast, Leora said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, but I'm more of a fan of free will. The leader's gaze turned hard, his voice a low growl. You won't stop me, the artifact is mine. Solis glanced at Leora and Quillen, each of them standing ready to do what needed to be done. Desperation hung over them like a storm cloud, but it was mingled with a determination that bordered on reckless. They had come too far to back down now. Let's do this, Solis said, his voice barely above a whisper. As they moved forward, the leader raised his hands, and the room seemed to pulse with a dark energy that sent a shiver down Solis's spine. The artifact, hidden somewhere within the ruins, was protecting its master and itself. Suddenly, everything happened at once. The leader lunged forward, and Quillen barely managed to sidestep, his reflexes saving him from a potentially ugly encounter. Leora darted towards a nearby console, hoping to interface with the city's broken network, a risky maneuver, but their only shot at turning the tide. Cover me, Leora shouted, fingers flying over the keys as she worked to override the artifact's influence. Wouldn't dream of doing anything else, Quillen replied, weaving around the faction leader with a mix of agility and bravado that bordered on foolish. Solis, meanwhile, was scanning the room with urgent eyes, looking for any hint of the artifact's location. It had to be close. The waves of emotion it was broadcasting rippled through him, an almost physical force that tugged at his mind. There, Solis shouted, spotting a glimmer of something beneath a pile of debris. It was subtle but unmistakable, the artifact, its presence unmistakable even amid the chaos. You won't touch it, the leader screamed, lunging towards Solis with a fury that seemed to defy logic. Solis braced himself for impact, but Quillen was there, intercepting the leader with a well-placed shoulder that sent the man sprawling. It was a brief reprieve, but enough for Solis to dive towards the artifact, his heart pounding in his chest. Keep him busy, Leora yelled, sweat beading on her forehead as she fought to crack the network's defenses. I need more time. Solis's fingers brushed against the artifact, its surface cold and alien. For a moment he hesitated, the weight of its power pressing down on him like an ocean. It was intoxicating, a seductive promise of control and chaos that whispered to the darkest corners of his soul. But Solis was no stranger to darkness. He had lived with it, danced on the razor's edge of survival in a city that cared for neither the living nor the dead. And he knew that this power was a lie, a trap wrapped in temptation. With a grunt of determination, he wrenched the artifact from its resting place, its connection to the leader severing with a palpable snap. The leader screamed, a sound of pure agony that reverberated through the room, but Solis forced himself not to flinch. Leora now, he shouted, the artifact thrumming in his hands like a living thing. I'm in, Leora replied, her voice triumphant. The lights flickered, and for a moment the oppressive weight of the artifact's influence lifted, leaving the room in an eerie silence. Quillen stepped back, breathing heavily but grinning with the kind of reckless satisfaction that came from surviving another impossible feat. Well, that was fun, he said, looking at Solis with a mix of respect and exasperation. Define fun, Solis replied, his grip on the artifact never loosening. It was a dangerous thing, a relic of a past that should never have been, and he wanted nothing more than to hurl it into the deepest abyss he could find. The leader lay on the floor, his fury spent and his will broken. Whatever power had driven him to madness was gone, leaving only a hollow shell of a man who had once dreamed of revolution. You think you've won, he rasped, his voice a shadow of its former strength. The artifact will find another way. It always does. Maybe, Solis admitted, his voice steady. But we'll be ready. The city outside was still teetering on the brink, but the immediate danger had passed. Solis knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Lattice would always find new ways to test its inhabitants' resolve. But for now, they had managed to pull it back from the brink one more time. As they stood amidst the wreckage of the council chambers, Solis felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The battle was far from over, but they had taken a step in the right direction, and that was more than he had dared to hope for. Well, that was a productive afternoon, Leora said, her voice tinged with the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting an entire city's worth of demons. So what's next? We figure out how to destroy this thing, Solis replied, his gaze fixed on the artifact. And maybe, just maybe, we find a way to give the city a future. Quillen clapped him on the shoulder, grinning despite the cuts and bruises that marred his skin. Sounds like a plan, but first I could really use a drink. Solis chuckled, the sound more genuine than he'd expected. You and me both. As they made their way back into the chaos of the city, Solis couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, a dangerous emotion in a place like Nick's Lattice, but one he was willing to hold onto for a little longer. In the end, they were just three people trying to make a difference in a world that had long since lost its way. But sometimes even the smallest actions could tip the scales, and as they walked into the uncertain future that awaited them, Solis knew they would continue to fight for a city that was both their home and their greatest challenge. And maybe, just maybe, they would find a way to save it from itself. The day had the audacity to be bright. It was one of those artificial sunlight days, courtesy of the city's malfunctioning neural net, which apparently decided that blinding brightness was the best remedy for existential despair. Solis squinted up at the sky, trying to decide if the headache forming behind his eyes was from the light or the persistent buzzing of the emotional dampeners. Tell me again why we're not getting sloshed right now, Quillen asked, his voice dripping with the kind of sarcasm that only semi-heroic deeds could inspire. He absently fiddled with a piece of debris, a leftover reminder of their latest encounter with the faction leader. Because, Leora cut in, her tone dry as the Martian desert, we have a city to save, or, condemned to further chaos. Either way, work to be done. She was already lost in the guts of console, fingers dancing across the interface with the speed and precision of someone who'd long since stopped caring about the rest of humanity. Right, save the city, save ourselves, and maybe find a way to get rid of this damn headache, Solis added, rubbing the bridge of his nose in a futile attempt to stave off the throb. So what's the genius plan then? Quillen asked, leaning against a wall that looked like it was one solid breeze away from total collapse. Because I've got to say, looking at that artifact in your hands doesn't exactly fill me with hope. Solis stared at the artifact, its alien contours both mesmerizing and repulsive. The plan, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt, is to use the city's neural net to broadcast a counter-signal, something to drown out the artifact's influence. Quillen raised an eyebrow. And how do we plan on doing that? We barely got it to stop broadcasting the emotional equivalent of a teenage angst playlist. Oh, it's simple, Leora said, her voice laced with sarcasm. We'll just tap into the neural net and upload a message of unity and cooperation. The kind of stuff that the human race is known for. Nothing like a bit of good old-fashioned optimism to start the apocalypse off right, Quillen quipped. And what happens when the net decides it prefers anarchy over harmony like the rest of us? Solis shrugged. Then we improvise, and if that doesn't work, we run. Fast, always a solid backup plan, Quillen said, grinning, running away. It's like humanity's greatest strength. Together they moved through the remnants of the council chambers, their footsteps echoing off walls that had heard more empty promises than any other place in the city. The artifact needed to be handled with care, and Solis was acutely aware of its presence, like holding a wild animal that could bite at any second. As they reached the central terminal, Leora set to work, her eyes gleaming with a determination that bordered on obsession. It was a look Solis recognized all too well, the one that said failure wasn't an option, mostly because failing meant dealing with even more of the city's crap. We'll need to bypass the security protocols, Leora muttered, half to herself, half to the universe at large. Assuming they still exist, which, given the current state of things, is a big assumption. Security, in Nick's Lattice, Quillen feigned shock. What a novel idea. Solis watched as Leora keyed in a series of commands, her focus absolute. It was moments like these that reminded him why they were friends, or allies at least. In a world where most people would sell you out for a hot meal and a half-charged energy cell, Leora was one of the few who could be counted on to not only stick around but actually make things happen. So, Solis said, trying to lighten the mood, what do you think our chances are? Leora smirked, never taking her eyes off the screen. Of success or just surviving the next IOR? Either. Both. Let's just say it's a good thing I'm not a betting woman. Quillen chuckled, his laughter a brief respite from the tension that hung over them like a storm cloud. Well, if we pull this off, drinks are on me. Bold words for a guy who hasn't seen a paycheck in months, Solis teased. As if we're getting out of this alive to spend money anyway, Quillen shot back, grinning. But hey, optimism, right? A sudden flicker on the console drew their attention, the neural net's interface finally opening up like a reluctant oyster. We're in, Leora announced, a note of triumph in her voice. Now comes the fun part. Define fun, Solis said, echoing his earlier sentiment. Staring into the abyss and hoping it doesn't stare back, Leora replied, her fingers flying over the keys as she began to upload the message they'd crafted, a simple, earnest appeal to the better angels of human nature, or at least what was left of them. Empathy and cooperation, Quillen mused, a hint of irony in his voice. You sure that'll work? I mean, I've seen what passes for empathy down in the lower sectors, and it ain't pretty. Well, it's either that or let the artifact keep broadcasting its delightful version of discord, Leora said, injecting just the right amount of sardonic cheer into her voice. Right, Quillen said. Empathy it is, then. Who knew we'd be trying to save the world with Hallmark card sentiments? Solis couldn't help but grin at that. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best, he said, and if not, there's always plan B, which is, run like hell. Leora snorted, the sound strangely comforting amid the chaos. You know, for a guy who's supposed to be an optimist, you sure do plan for failure a lot. That's because reality tends to have a way of disappointing, Solis replied, watching as the message began to upload, a digital prayer sent across the fractured veins of a city that had forgotten how to feel. As the upload progressed, the room seemed to hold its breath. Solis felt the tension in his gut twist tighter, a knot of hope and dread that threatened to unspool at any moment. The artifact lay silent now, its influence waning, but the real test was still to come. Almost there, Leora said, her eyes locked on the screen. Just a little longer. Solis nodded, his gaze drifting to the window where the city sprawled beneath them like a slumbering giant. Lattice had seen better days and worse, but for the first time in a long time, Solis felt a flicker of something dangerously close to hope. Hey, Quillen said, nudging him with an elbow. You okay? You've got that look. What look? Solis asked, more out of habit than any real curiosity. Like you're about to do something stupidly heroic. Solis laughed, the sound stark against the background hum of the dampeners. Guess I'm just full of surprises today. The upload meter ticked towards completion, each percentage point a small victory in a war they hadn't asked to fight. Solis watched as the final digits flashed green, signaling success, and felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. It's done, Leora said, leaning back with a sigh of relief. The message is out there. Think it'll work? Quillen asked, his voice uncharacteristically earnest. Depends, Solis said, on whether people are ready to listen. We'll find out soon enough, Leora replied, her gaze shifting to the city beyond. One way or another, for a moment they stood in silence, each contemplating the consequences of their actions. It was a quiet, fragile moment, like the calm before a storm, a pause in the madness that was Lattice, where anything and everything could happen. Well, Quillen said, breaking the silence with his usual irreverence, if we've just accidentally doomed the city to a fate worse than death, I say we celebrate either way. Solis chuckled, shaking his head. Sounds like a plan. First, let's make sure we haven't accidentally declared war on the lower sectors. Always the pessimist, Leora said, but the warmth in her voice belied her words. They left the terminal behind, stepping out into the cacophony of the city that was slowly starting to wake from its slumber. The neural net's influence was subtle at first, a gentle ripple in the sea of human emotion that shifted the tides ever so slightly. But as they moved through the streets, Solis could see the change taking hold. People moved with a little less aggression, a little more patience. The drones overhead buzzed with a sense of purpose rather than menace, and even the digital advertisements seemed a touch less garish. Looks like it's working, Quillen said, his tone laced with disbelief. Yeah, Solis replied, a hint of wonder in his voice. Maybe it is. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the city felt like it was on the edge of something new, a chance to rewrite its story, to find a path that didn't end in destruction. And as they walked towards whatever awaited them next, Solis allowed himself a rare moment of optimism. The battle was far from over, but they had taken a step towards something better, and that was more than he had dared to hope for. Well, Quillen said, clapping Solis on the back, looks like we might just live to see another day. Yeah, Solis said, smiling despite himself, and who knows? Maybe tomorrow will be the day we finally get those drinks. As they disappeared into the thrumming heartbeat of Lattice, their future uncertain but their resolve unwavering, Solis couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, a dangerous emotion in a city like theirs, but one he was willing to hold on to for a little longer. Solis and Quillen strolled through Lattice as if they owned the place, which was laughable considering they'd be lucky to own a decent pair of shoes. The lingering buzz of the city's neural net, now infused with their message of hope, or whatever passed for it, was like a caffeine buzz after 6 cups of cheap space coffee. It was subtle, sure, but had the potential to give the masses a collective nudge back from the brink of tearing each other apart. Feels different, doesn't it? Quillen said, peering up at the malfunctioning neon sign that flickered like a dying star. It was advertising some life-improving gadget that probably doubled as a paperweight. Yeah, Solis replied, squinting against the artificial sunlight that could give you a migraine in 30 seconds flat. For once, I don't feel like I'm about to get mugged every time I turn a corner. Don't get too comfortable, Quillen cautioned. This is still Lattice. The only thing that'll change permanently here is the expiration date on your last can of NutriPaste. True enough, Solis said, glancing at a group of faction members who seemed more interested in their shoes than bashing heads. But it's a start. Leora joined them, her expression one of cautious triumph. I think it's working, she said, a little winded from running after them. The artifact's influence is waning. People are, well, not killing each other, at least. That's what we call progress around here, Quillen said, nodding sagely. Low bar, maybe, but you take what you can get. They headed toward the heart of the city, where the factions had been gearing up for what promised to be a spectacularly pointless showdown. Solis could see the tension in the air, a kind of electric charge that buzzed along his skin like the static before a storm. Only now it felt like that storm might just blow over. Think they'll be receptive to our message of peace and goodwill? Leora asked, sarcasm dripping from every word. Receptive, no, confused and slightly off balance. More likely, Solis replied, watching as faction leaders gathered, looking around with suspicion rather than outright hostility. Quillen scratched his chin, where the hint of stubble was starting to gather an impressive collection of lint. You ever wonder if maybe we're the crazy ones? I mean, they say insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, Leora snorted. In a city like this, insanity is the only way you get anything done. Solis raised an eyebrow, spoken like a true genius. The trio advanced into the fray, or what was left of it. The factions had gathered in the shadow of the council chambers, their leaders locked in heated discussions that were beginning to resemble intense debates rather than open warfare. It was a promising change, albeit not one that would have anyone singing Kumbaya. Hey, look who decided to show up, a voice sneered from the crowd. It was Rax, a faction leader with a face like a slapped arse and a personality to match. Our little peacemakers. Rax, Solis said, flashing a grin that was more teeth than warmth. Nice to see you're still clinging to your delusions of relevance. Rax spat on the ground, the universal sign of disdain in any corner of the cosmos. What kind of game are you three playing at? The kind where you don't shoot first and ask questions never, Quillen said, hands raised in mock surrender. Crazy, I know. Rax's cronies bristled, hands twitching near their weapons, but the leader held them back with a gesture. Explain, he demanded. Solis took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the city's eyes on them. The artifact's influence has been muted, for now at least. We're just here to suggest that maybe, just maybe, it's time we stopped acting like barbarians and started thinking about what's best for all of us. And what's that? Listening to you, Rax scoffed. Quillen shrugged. Look, we're not saying we've got all the answers. But we've got one less problem without that artifact screwing with everyone's heads. It's a chance to reset, maybe figure out why we started fighting in the first place. Because they're a bunch of greedy bastards, Rax muttered, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Solis recognized it, the moment's pause, the slight hesitation. It was the crack in the wall, the opening they desperately needed. Look, you can keep fighting, tearing each other apart, until there's nothing left but ruins and regrets, or you can just try, a different path. Leora nodded, stepping forward. We're not asking for miracles, just a ceasefire, a chance to talk. Rax studied them, eyes narrowing as he weighed their words. Solis held his breath, acutely aware of the fine line they were walking. One misstep and everything they'd worked for could unravel faster than a cheap sweater in a black hole. Finally, Rax nodded, a short, sharp jerk of his head. Fine, a ceasefire, but only because I think you'll be more entertaining alive than dead. Glad to hear we're useful for something, Quillen said, the relief palpable in his voice. As the faction leaders began to disperse, Solis allowed himself a rare moment of hope. It was the kind of hope that came with a side of caution, of course, because Lattice wasn't built for fairy tale endings. But it was hope nonetheless, and that was more than he'd had at the start of the day. Well, Leora said, her voice laced with the kind of disbelief usually reserved for three-legged race winners at the annual Drunkoff. That went better than expected. Yeah, Solis agreed, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. It's a start. Quillen clapped him on the back. See, I knew I kept you around for a reason, Solis chuckled. And here I thought it was because of my charming personality. Leora rolled her eyes. You two are impossible. That's what makes us interesting, Quillen quipped. As they made their way back through the city, Solis couldn't help but notice the subtle changes taking place. People were moving with a little more purpose, a little less fear. The chaos had been dialed down from a 10 to a manageable 7, which in this city was about as good as it got. Do you think it'll hold? Leora asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. I think it depends on us, Solis replied, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders once more. But for now, Quillen said, I say we celebrate. And how do you propose we do that? Leora asked, skepticism etched into every line of her face. Quillen grinned. I hear there's a place in the lower sectors that serves emotionally enhanced hot dogs. Might be worth checking out. Solis laughed, the sound echoing in the narrow alleyways like a promise. You know what? That sounds like the best idea I've heard all day. because in a city like Lattice, sometimes all you needed was a little hope, a little laughter, and maybe, just maybe, a hot dog that could make you weep. As they disappeared into the thrumming heartbeat of the city, their future uncertain but their resolve unwavering, Solis couldn't help but feel that they'd taken a step towards something better. And for the first time in a long time, he was willing to hold onto that feeling for a little while longer. The day after Lattice didn't implode was a sunny one. Ironic, given the artificial sunlight that still flickered like a disco ball on a bad trip. Solis stood in the middle of a plaza that had seen more riots than dance-offs and took in the buzz of activity, people actually fixing things instead of each other's faces. There's something satisfying about watching this lot pretend to be civilized, Quillen said, nodding at a group attempting to replace a broken neural conduit with what looked like a very determined piece of garden hose. Pretend being the key word, Solis replied, scratching the back of his head where the augments itched like a persistent rash. But hey, at least nobody's stabbing anyone today. Progress, Leora joined them, looking like a kid who'd just discovered a candy store that accepted favors instead of credits. We're not dead, and the artifact's influence is down to a mild annoyance rather than a full-blown seizure. I'd call that a win. I'll toast to that, Quillen said, raising an imaginary glass. Assuming we can find anything around here that won't poison us. Good luck with that, Leora smirked. I think the last safe drink was outlawed right before they legalized emotional hot dogs. Solis chuckled, watching a couple of drones zip overhead, each one carrying a payload that seemed more interested in surveillance than subtlety. At least the drones are back to spying rather than dive bombing, and the hovercars are still mostly going where instructed, Quillen added, pointing to a vehicle that swerved only slightly as it avoided a group of kids playing in the street. Mostly, Solis echoed, as the hovercar clipped a loose sign, sending it clattering to the ground. Gives city living a whole new meaning, doesn't it? The three of them wandered through the streets, passing by the ruins of the Grand Council chamber. The entrance stood like a monument to failed political ambition. Even pigeons seemed to give it a wide berth. Think they'll rebuild? Leora asked, gesturing to the crumbling structure. If they do, it'll probably involve more duct tape than diplomacy, Quillen said. But hey, at least they'll all have something to argue about again, Solis shrugged. Reconstruction's always a good excuse to inflate budgets and egos. Who knows, might even inspire a new faction, the League of Overpriced Contractors. The day unfolded in a series of minor miracles. The neural net, while still occasionally flashing the odd cat meme or philosophical musing, was mostly stable. People were talking, rebuilding, and occasionally even laughing. A few street vendors had set up shop, selling everything from dubious-looking NutriPaste to emotionally enhanced hot dogs that promised the taste of nostalgia with the indigestion of regret. Quillen stopped at one such stand, eyeing the neon-colored tubes of meat with a mix of awe and trepidation. Think we should try one. Could be good for a laugh, depends. Do you enjoy crying over your meal? Leora asked, eyeing the happy-sad special with suspicion. Solis glanced at the vendor, a woman whose expression suggested she'd been born tired. One, please. If it kills me, I'm holding you two responsible. The vendor handed over the hot dog with all the enthusiasm of a hospital nurse on graveyard duty. Solis took a bite and for one brief, horrifying moment, felt an overwhelming sense of nostalgia. It was like being a kid again, only with more gastrointestinal distress. Well, Quillen asked. Solis swallowed, fighting back tears, or were they gas bubbles? Tastes like childhood trauma with a side of melancholy. That bad, huh? Leora snorted. No, it's worse, Solis said, wiping his eyes. But I think I'm going to survive. Together, they continued their trek through Lattice, the city slowly knitting itself back together. The factions had agreed to a ceasefire, tentative, sure, but a ceasefire nonetheless. People were tentatively hopeful, a rare commodity in a place built on cynicism and scavenged parts. Quillen looked around, shaking his head. Never thought I'd live to see this. A city not entirely at war with itself. Don't jinx it, Leora warned. Optimism's a dangerous game. Tell me about it, Solis replied, rubbing the back of his neck. But maybe, just maybe, we've got a shot at making this place livable. They passed a group of kids who were playing with a patched-up drone, their laughter echoing off the walls. Solis watched them for a moment, feeling an unexpected warmth that wasn't entirely due to the malfunctioning sunlight. Think they'll remember this day? He asked. Maybe, Quillen said. Or maybe they'll just remember the hot dogs. Either way, it's something, Leora added, a soft smile playing on her lips. As they walked, the trio found themselves caught in the pull of a city on the mend. They passed street artists painting murals over old propaganda, musicians tuning instruments that had seen better days, and people who were beginning to trust their neighbors, if only a little. For Solis, it was a revelation, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the universe, there was room for change. He turned to his companions, their faces reflecting the same cautious hope he felt. The city, he began, struggling to find the right words. It's a mess, but it's our mess, and for the first time it feels like we've got a say in how we clean it up. Quillen grinned. Here's to chaos then. Long may it rain, Leora chuckled. And to us for surviving it. As they strolled deeper into Nick's lattice, Solis felt the city's pulse matching his own. It was a place of contradictions, of beauty and brutality, where every street was a gamble and every day a test. But it was also a place where they'd found something worth fighting for, a future, a chance to build, to grow, and perhaps to thrive. Think we'll make it? Solis asked, glancing at his friends. If we don't, I'll haunt you, Quillen said, only half joking. Leora nodded. We will. We have to, Solis smiled, feeling the weight of their journey settle into something manageable. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was a beginning, and in a city like theirs, that was more than enough. As they walked away from the chaos of yesterday and into the promise of tomorrow, Solis finally dared to believe in a better future, one paved with snark, sweat, and an unhealthy dose of emotional hot dogs. Hey, remember when we thought this place couldn't change? Quillen said, breaking the silence. Yes, Solis replied. Turns out we were wrong. Guess there's a first time for everything, Leora added, her eyes scanning the horizon. The three of them stood there, surrounded by a city in flux, a world teetering on the edge of something new. It was risky and raw, full of potential and pitfalls, but it was theirs. Solis took a deep breath, feeling the air hum with possibility. He turned to his friends, his allies, his family. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Quillen echoed, offering a rare, genuine smile. Leora nodded, her voice steady. Always. And with that, they moved forward into the heart of Nick's lattice, where the future awaited, unknown, uncharted, and undeniably theirs to shape.